Whip it real good. This is an Overland, 1929 Overland Whip It. Now this car was actually marketed for females back in 1929. That's why it's a little bit shorter. You don't see any side mounts on it. It's a basic automobile. But the one thing I love about this automobile being basically designed for the women driving back then in 1929 was they had the rumble seat. Cute thing about the rumble seat, when they first started with rumble seats in automobiles like this, they called it the mother-in-law seat. You were able to put your mother-in-law on the outside of the automobile and drive in complete comfort. Beautiful car. In the 20s, roaring 20s especially, they started painting cars these types of colors, these bright colors. A little bit of history about that is, number one, movie stars wanted cars in bright colors. So they actually ordered cars that may have looked something like this. But the second part of that story, who really made it work back in the 20s, was E.J. Cord. Actually took over the Cord dealership, and he actually had about, I heard, anywhere from 7 to 1,000 cars in the back lot. And he actually had them bring them back in. Instead of making another year of automobiles, he brought them back in and painted them really cool colors. I remember one story I read recently, Artie Shaw of the big band era came through Indiana. He actually picked up his car. By the time he was finished picking up his car, 4 or 5 of his band members actually bought automobiles from Cord. Wonderful car. We're at Father's Day. I had to do this one, folks, because I came over here, I asked Al a question about today's show, and Al goes, I know about you. I gave him a card. RichieZ.com is our website. And he goes, I know you. I watched your show yesterday. So Al, thanks for watching our show, and what a beautiful car. 1937 LaSalle. This automobile in the General Motors line has amazing history. In fact, it was during the era of Harley Earl, probably the most unbelievable automobile designer in the history of the automobile. Take a look at the styling on this 1937 LaSalle. But LaSalle and Cadillac were very, very similar. The only thing, LaSalle was a little less expensive than Cadillac in the General Motors line. Well, Harley Earl was the one that actually made the decision to take LaSalle out of the lineup in the General Motors line. They had an inexpensive luxury car. In fact, they had a few of them, Pontiac, Buick, and Oldsmobile. So this car was actually competing with its own General Motors brand. And I'll tell you, really, I read a wonderful part of this story was a lot of people that were Cadillac buyers were actually buying LaSalle. So it was actually hurting the sales of Cadillac at the General Motors line. But this one, when I walked by it, this is just an amazing, gorgeous, sleek, aerodynamic, beautiful 1937 LaSalle. 1952 Packard. Folks, I've done a lot of car shows, and I think some of you have heard me mention Packard. Packard has always been one of my favorites. When I was a kid, I remember Packard being around. But Packard was very, very popular in America from 1899 to 1958. And then the Soviet Union actually bought Packard and they took it out there. But this is a gorgeous 1952 Packard. This was considered a luxury car from the very get-go in the automobile industry. But to have a 52 Packard convertible with factory air conditioning, this is extremely rare. What a beautiful 1952 Packard. 1948 Tucker. Probably the most interesting automobile ever built in the city of Chicago. Saying that is kind of something because at the turn of the century, we had 100 manufacturers of automobiles in Chicago, Illinois. But this was in the 40s. Princeton Tucker actually came up with this concept, this idea. Now, there was movies made about it, a lot of controversy throughout the years. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Tucker, and everybody always says, well, he didn't make it because the big three took him out. That was a piece of the story, I'll give you that. But the major fact of the story was he didn't have any money. He raised anywhere from $42 to $48 million from everything I read from history. Well, back then in the 40s, it took GM or Ford about $300 million just to retool the plant for a new car. Tucker was built on the south side. The Ford City shopping center is where the Ford plant, the Tucker plant was. They built 48 of these. They took them to court because of taking money from people. People bought stock in the company, and he wasn't able to actually do what he needed to do. Wonderful automobile, wonderful styling. There were 21 different things in this automobile, from disc brakes to aluminum engine to safety glass that actually popped out, super aerodynamic, so many things, seat belts, so many things that we see in automobiles today, I believe, started with a gentleman named Princeton Tucker back in the 40s. Padded dashboards, none of those things were available back then. 1930 Packard. This is a gorgeous automobile. I mean, this one really takes the cake, or should I say pumpkin pie here, with the orange colors, the creamy, rich gold colors, and the brown. But this is a real interesting 1930 Packard. It has the luggage on the back. Now, when you bought an automobile like this, they actually sold you luggage if you wanted it, and there was actually a thing that folds down to hold the luggage in place. Back then, they originally called it a trunk, and that's where the term trunk originated from, automobiles of the 20s. But this one actually came with an interesting concept here, a little side door where you can slide your things into. Look at, we have a bag full of golf clubs for the ultimate motoring enthusiast and the golf enthusiast. 1930 Packard. I'm here with Bob. Now, Bob, you've been my friend for, I've been doing this 26 years.
And at least 26 years, right?
And yes, you have been.
Yeah,
Bob
right.
is a class act. You're always here at this Father's Day show every year. You guys always bring out the sunshine and beautiful automobiles.
How do you like that? You know, we got a special pipeline on this one.
This is unbelievable with all the rain we've been having lately. But
Yeah.
this 26 Rolls Royce, tell me a little about it.
Well, this is a Phantom 1 Rolls. It was built in Springfield, Massachusetts. It's an American-built Rolls Royce, and they built them here until the early 30s. The body is by Brewster, which was a body company in New York. The car ultimately was owned by Constance Bennett, who was a very big movie star in the 1930s. She was particularly famous for the Topper movies.
Okay.
And this was her car that she had in Hollywood. She had it basically for movie premieres and parties. That's what she used it for.
Now, you're a real purist when it comes to these automobiles, and what I mean by that is this one is all original, the way you got it.
Yeah, it's all original, basically.
You won't even recover the seats or anything like that.
You know, I probably should recover the seat, but I don't think I'm going to. I like leaving the car all original.
That's what I mean. You're a purist, and you like it.
I like the history.
Right. And you know what? There's something to be said about every part of the auto industry. The guy that wants the trailer queen,
Yeah.
and the one that wants something that's all original, so you can, like you say.
To me, the original cars have a sense of history.
Right.
And that sense of history gets lost in a complete restoration.
Bob, to the next 26 years, I hope you're still my friend 26 years from now.
I'm planning on it, my friend. Nice to see you today.
Thank you. 1903 Oldsmobile. This is a car in the General Motors line. This is actually the oldest manufactured automobile, was Oldsmobile in the General Motors line. Rancid Old was the first car and made that had the GM trademark. One of the first to go back in the early 2000s. But another thing, a lot of you know I do history and I've done a lot of stuff on radio and that. I told the Henry Ford story, the assembly line and all of that, the Rouge plant. People actually said something to me, well, he wasn't the first to have an assembly line. The story goes like this, folks. Rancid Olds was the first to have an assembly line in the automobile industry. But Henry Ford was the first to perfect the assembly line in the automobile industry. But this is a great automobile. Let me just mention one thing. We're at the Father's Day show in Oak Brook, Illinois. I've been doing this show off and on for the last 26 years. And you know what? It never ceases to amaze. I tell everybody about this show, and here's one of the reasons why. This automobile, I'm sure, never looked this good when it was first made back in 1903. But the gentleman that owns this restored it to perfection. And this is a trailer queen, we call it in the industry, but it is a gorgeous part of the automobile industry, a gorgeous part of the Oldsmobile history. 1930 Cord. Now, Cord was an interesting individual in the auto industry, but back then there were so many people that were trying to do things. We're working on the Cord story for our radio show, Chicago History and Automotive Heaven, at RichieZ.com. That's RICHIE, Z like in zebra, IE.com. You can hear all the wonderful automotive and Chicago history stories, but the Cord story is just overwhelming with information in that. He took over the company when it wasn't doing well at all, and in a short period of time he actually turned the company around. This is one of the interesting points back then. This car was huge in racing. They actually put that fin on the back in the center. They called it the boat tail speedster. The reason for that boat tail was in races, if you got real close, and to this very day it works, if you get close to the guy in front of you, you're actually caught up in his tailwind, and he's actually drawing you through the race. By putting in this back in 1930, they eliminated that drag on the back and made this a lot faster than it was before, not pulling the car behind it. 1928 Harley Davidsons. We actually have two of them here from 1928. Both of them are all original. And I heard that both of them are actually able to be driven and used. Actually, you can ride these on the street. But this is a part of history. Harley has had its ups and downs in the industry, but I think Harley Davidson right now is back and doing extremely well. In fact, I went to a Harley meet a few weeks ago in Woodstock, Illinois, and there was in excess of about 1,500 motorcycles that showed up for that event. If you ever have the opportunity, they actually bought the old Kmart on Route 47 in Woodstock and turned it into a Harley Davidson dealership and complete service center. 1953 Hudson Hornet, Twin H. The Twin H stood for twin carburetors. It was a one-barrel carburetor, but if anybody is familiar with the carburetors back then, the one-barrel carburetor was probably, the opening was about 3 inches around at best. With the Tucker, they were about 5 inches round, the one-barrel carburetor. It was basically like pouring gas into the engine. But I've known a lot about the Tuckers. In fact, some of my neighbors, when I was growing up, had these things. But interesting part about these were they were used in a lot of customizing back in the era. They would actually chop the top. They were used in a lot of demolition derbies. No matter what you did to this automobile, it just kept going. It was like a tank, basically, back then. Real wonderful automobile. And here's a gorgeous 1953 Hudson Hornet sports car. I grew up in this era, so I really loved the way this, back then, even the 61, 62 Pontiac Bonnevilles were really gorgeous. But this one, you know, I wish they could bring back the era I lived in, because automobiles like this, but then again, all the automobiles back then, you can tell it was an Oldsmobile or a Buick. Back in this era, all automobiles had a distinct styling. You can tell what it was coming at you down the street. And GM especially back then had styling beyond belief. I don't think we'll ever see that again in the automobile industry. It started back in the Harley Earl era and then moved on to other designers in the GM line. But this is a gorgeous automobile. I remember they came out with the bucket seats and the console. Just so many interesting features. 1962 Oldsmobile Starfire, a real gorgeous automobile. 1967 Pontiac GTO. GTO has a very interesting history. Pontiac. In fact, let me start out with the beginning of GTO and the Pontiac line. The gentleman that actually started this whole phenomena of GTO was John DeLorean. Probably one of the most rebel car designers, and he became in charge of Pontiac. I'm going to tell a little story about John DeLorean. When he took over Pontiac back in the late 50s, I think General Motors was contemplating maybe even getting rid of Pontiac because it was just going along. They weren't doing great numbers or anything. I think that they put DeLorean in charge because if they took it down, they could blame DeLorean. Well, back in the 50s, late 50s, they came out to 389 with the 3 deuces, 2 4-barrels, and they started winning races. It was the beginning of the muscle car era, and John DeLorean fell into something he loved and adored. In fact, a Pontiac Tempest was where he first put that 389 into back in the early 60s. I believe it was 61, 62, and the car basically would fly. Well, by 63, 64, they came out. They took a Tempest, but they actually put the GTO logo on it, and the rest was history. A couple top things about GTO. This one here, the 1967, I think had the prettiest body lines of its era, of the 60s. The taillights were just gorgeous. But 1970, there was a television series called Laugh-In. And they had Flip Winston running across the stage yelling, "Here comes the judge, here comes the judge." Well, let me tell you something. John DeLorean got the idea from Laugh-In to do the Judge GTO. Wonderful history. I think this is one of the sexiest, most attractive looking GTOs ever made. The 1967 GTO by Pontiac. After World War II, when the GIs came back to America from Europe, they brought back a lot of the European sports cars. While they were out there in the war, they actually drove a lot of these cars and fell in love with them. This is probably one of the top 3 automobiles. Austin Healey was just an amazing automobile as far as handling, maneuverability, and fun to drive in that, but also it was extremely sexy. And you've heard me use the term sexy in today's show. Boy, automobiles are like ladies. They all have something that appeals to someone. And we grew up in a real interesting time. This was my era with automobiles, and seeing these automobiles on the street, being able to ride in them, and then when I was able to get my driver's license and drive some of them, the interest in these cars just grew and grew and grew, from the looks to riding in them to actually driving and owning some of them. This is a gorgeous 1961 Austin Healey. 1958 Pontiac Parisian. I'm here with Dave. Dave, I met you a few years ago. This is an amazing story. I want you to be short and sweet, but I want you to know, I want you to tell me about this. Is a gorgeous car. This is really unique, rare, but it's really, really pretty. Tell us a little bit about it.
Well, my love with 58 Pontiacs began actually in 1958 when my father was looking for a new car at that time. And he went to a bunch of dealers looking at different makes of cars, and came home with a bunch of promos that they used to give away to prospective car buyers. And one of them was 58 Pontiac. And I just cherished that thing. I loved cars back then, and loved that promo, and always thought someday I'd like to have one. And about a year ago, I went to the Auctions America classic car auction in Auburn, Indiana. And I actually went there to look at a different car, and this car just happened to be parked next to it in the staging area. And when I saw this car, I said, forget the other one. I fell in love with this one. And I was fortunate enough to be the winning bidder on it. And
this is not an American car, though, right? It was actually built in Canada, right? Very rare. Give me a little bit on the stats on that.
Yeah, it was built in Oshawa, Canada, which is right across the border from Detroit. And they had one plant there that built all the GM cars on the different names for Canada. They weren't able to bring American cars up there. I believe it was for tax purposes. They couldn't afford to bring American cars up there. There was a big duty on them. So they built their own cars up there, and they had to give them different names. So the top of the line became the Parisienne in 1958, and it was basically known as the Canadian Bonneville. It was very similar to the Pontiac Bonneville, but because it was built in this Canadian plant that made mainly Chevys, it came on a Chevy chassis and drivetrain.
But there were different body styles. There were different things on this were really distinguished it from being an American car, right? Not just the name, or
no, appearance-wise, they were very identical. The wheelbase, being its Chevy chassis, was maybe 4 inches shorter than the American Bonneville, but everything else looks identical. But they did have to use their own special Parisian body panels because the American Bonneville body panels would not fit on the Chevy chassis. So the body panels on this car.
So it was a little modified here and there. How many of these did they make? Because I've never seen one of these, and I've been loving automobiles for 50 years.
They only made 759 Parisiennes in 1958. It was the first year.
So if we're lucky, we maybe have 7 to 10 left in existence.
Well, they made 759 total. Of that, probably about 100 were convertibles. So yeah, you're talking about just a handful of cars.
Gorgeous car. Dave, thank you, and I was hoping I'd run into you again with this gorgeous automobile. 1958 Pontiac Parisian, which was built in Canada, but it's found its way back home here to Oak Brook, Illinois, Father's Day car show. Now I know where they got the term Pink Lady from. That's a drink that became popular in the 50s. I think they took it from this automobile here, a 1955 Ford Sky Sunliner. This is a real interesting automobile. Back in the the 50s, Ford Motor Company was struggling. But in 1955, there was a gentleman that took over Ford Motor Company, and his name was Lee Iacocca. Well, he didn't even take over, but he was actually a marketing manager, and he came out with a campaign of 55 in 55 for your 55. So if you bought a 55 Ford, it cost you $55 down and $55 a month to buy an automobile like this. This is actually called the Pink Lady. Two wonderful people behind the car. I don't know if we can see them or not, but they both have pink on, and they're reliving a little bit of their youth. You know, a lot of people in these shows will actually come here, and with their automobiles, they will relive a little bit of nostalgia. This was a great time. They have the tray on the side of the car where they used to go, and car hops would come up to your car and that. Beautiful car, beautiful era, 1955 Ford convertible Skyliner. 1966 Imperial Crown. Now, if you've ever watched the Green Hornet TV series, it wasn't a convertible, it was a four-door, but they actually used the Imperial, Chrysler Imperial for the Green Hornet. But this is, I've been looking to do a little, shake it up a little bit in the television industry. This is very rare. I have not. 1960 Buick LeSabre. They actually made an Invicta also that was basically the same body style, but it was a little more luxurious. But this is one of the largest Buick convertibles ever made. 1960 was the last time you would see something this large in the Buick line. They started downsizing the automobiles. But that being said, when you take a look at it, they talk about sometimes aerodynamics now like they invented it. Take a look at this car, how sleek it is, the body lines, everything's rounded. Even the windshield is rounded. It comes up the cowl and rounded around the edges. Very, very stylish. This was part of the Harley Earl design in General Motors. You know, I wonder what Harley Earl would actually do if he came back today and saw what Bob Lutz and the gang of destroyers did to General Motors after Durant and Earl, what they did building the thing. I think there'd be a lynching in the town square. But this is a gorgeous, all these cars here, we're at Father's Day in Oak Brook, Illinois. This has been going on for over 40 years. So next year, folks, if you want to take Dad out for something he'll really enjoy, bring him to Oak Brook, Illinois, the shopping center, the mall, and spend a day looking at gorgeous, gorgeous automobiles. I'm Richie C. for Automotive Heaven. Thank you for watching. Seen one of these in years at the auctions going through, or at even any of the car shows that we do. So it's a beautiful 1966 Imperial convertible Crown.